My job is to create videos teaching you various different web development topics. In order to do that, I need to learn a lot of topics relatively quickly at a really deep level. So in this video, I'm going to take you through step by step exactly how I learn a new technology. And instead of just telling you what I do, I'm going to show you exactly what I do by learning Tanstack Start from scratch throughout this entire video. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name's Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. And the very first step that I take with learning anything is figuring out where my current knowledge level is, not only with the tool that I'm trying to learn, but also with everything that's tangentially related to it. So in my case, when it comes to Tanstack Start, I don't have very much familiarity with it. I've used Tanstack Router a very small amount. Right when it first came out in alpha, I took a look at it and just familiarized myself with it, but I never went very deep or learned very much about it. I did create my very own React router recently, just like a couple months ago, and that caused me to actually look at some of the source code for Tanstack Router. So I do have a little bit of familiarity with the source code of how it works behind the scenes, but again, not very much familiarity with how it works overall. And I've not created anything with Tanstack Start at all. So I have almost no experience with Tanstack Start itself. I've seen some people use it in some YouTube videos here and there, but otherwise I don't know anything at all about it. So when I start in a place like this where I have almost no knowledge about something, I generally like to first start by figuring out more information about what this tool is, what it can do, and why I even want to use it. I just want to get the high level overview. I don't even care about diving into the code yet. For me, all I know about Tanstack Start is you can use it as like a React framework, kind of similar to Next.js or Astro. And based on this documentation, it actually says it works with Solid as well. So from here, there are usually two places that I'll go. The first place that I'll go is the documentation, relatively self-explanatory. I'll go to the getting started documentation, and sometimes there's going to be a section like this overview page where this kind of gives me just an overview of what is this particular tool, why would I want to use it, as you can see how it works, when you should use it. I like to just skim this page. I don't read it all word for word exactly what it is, but I like to skim this to figure out, is this even a tool that I want to learn? Because oftentimes you may hear about something cool, and then when you find out more about what this tool is, you realize, oh, this isn't actually something that I care about. So I would go through and read through all this documentation, which is what I'm going to do. And the second thing that I like to do is I like to go to YouTube and I like to search for videos that are like getting started with the Tanstack Start, or what is Tanstack Start, or why would I use Tanstack Start, to get a high level overview. I don't care about diving into code yet. I mean, I may see some code, that's fine, but really I want to figure out, what does this tool do, what problems does it solve, and why do I care about using it? Now in this particular case, Tanstack Start does have this really great overview page, so I'm going to read through this and I'm going to come back to you to figure out what I've learned from this. So reading through this documentation, I already see quite a few things that stick out with me. The first thing, which is something I already was kind of familiar with, is that they put a lot of emphasis on type safety and TypeScript. When I was reading through this what you get section, over half of these points had something to do with TypeScript, type safety, validation, schemas, that kind of stuff, which I really like. I like type safety, I like TypeScript, and there's a lot of problems I have with Next.js when it comes to type safety that I think that Tanstack does a really good job of solving from what I've read from here. The other thing that I noticed by reading this is that there are certain places where it deviates from a framework like Next.js. And you may notice me comparing it a lot to Next.js because that is what I am most familiar with. I've worked with Next.js, Astro, and now I'm trying to compare Tanstack Start to those different frameworks I've worked with. And Next.js is the one I have the most familiarity with, that is the most similar to this particular type of tool. So one place where I see that they differ a lot is that Tanstack Start, they do have a lot of server-side rendering related stuff, but because it's built on the Tanstack system and Tanstack has Tanstack Query, my guess, and based on some of the things that I read inside of here, which had some stuff to do with like client-side data caches, is that they actually push a little bit more onto the client side and a little bit less onto the server side, while with Next.js, they seem to try to push you more towards the server and less towards the client. So I'm interested to see how that kind of dichotomy comes out. And also, when I was reading through some of this, I noticed that this section down here of when you might not versus when you do want to use it is that they do mention they have a lot of information for server-side rendering, streaming, all that kind of stuff you get with Next.js, but they specifically mention it's not very good for static sites, which makes sense. I usually use Astro when I want a static site. They also say that it's really not great if you want a purely server-rendered site, which is something that's really interesting because a lot of times Next.js, I think, has a lot of really good tools for like specifically only using server-side rendering without a lot of client-side stuff. So this seems to be leaning a little bit more towards the client side in that reaction. And the big thing is that they don't support React Server components yet. That doesn't really surprise me because this is only in alpha at the time. You can see it's a V0, maybe it's beta right now. It's very early on. So they don't support React Server components yet, but they say that they will be supporting React Server components with their own little twist on it. So I think this tool will become much more useful to me when they support React Server components, at least at a high level just from looking at it, because React Server components do have a lot of really cool features, but I still want to dive further into this to figure out more about this system. So I've right now looked through this documentation, and for me, this solved all the questions I had. I don't feel like I need a YouTube video that'll explain what Tanstack Start is, because this gave me a really good overview. So the next thing I like to do is I just like to dive straight into the code without reading any more documentation. Some people really like to go through a lot of documentation, but for me, I just want to get to the getting started page and dive through the code. Now, I did notice on the homepage for Tanstack Start, if I go to that page real quick, there's a section right here for try in 60 seconds, which is honestly probably just where I want to start, because that is really what speaks to me. Get started is, I think, where I'll go to next after I look at the try in 60 seconds. So when I click on this, it just gives me a bunch of stuff that essentially I can pick down some code and pretty much have a starting example within 60 seconds, which is really what I want to do. So I just run ahead and ran those commands inside of VS Code, so I at least have the code to look at, and I have the application on the right running, which lets me navigate through some pages. I haven't looked at any of this yet, so you can just see a lot of different information for everything that's going on. It looks like we have pathless routes, we have some nested route stuff going on, some deferred routes, lots of different stuff for me to get into. And honestly, this is actually more code than I expected to get out of the box for this basic example. So from here, the reason I feel comfortable just diving into the code is because I have familiarity with certain frameworks that are similar, such as working with Next.js or Astro, or even just other frameworks that are full stack frameworks. I've worked with quite a few in the past. So I feel comfortable kind of diving into the code because I know the different patterns that I should be able to see and go, oh, this is how Tanstack handles this thing versus how Next or Astro does something similar. So what I do next is I just dive into the code, start looking through it and trying to figure out, okay, how do they do routing? How do they handle this? I'm not really looking to fully understand the code. I'm trying to get a high level of how different things work. Now, if I was starting from scratch and had no familiarity with full stack or anything like that, I would probably just completely skip this step and read the documentation into getting started all the way through. But since like I said, I have familiarity with full stack frameworks, I kind of know what to look for. So the very first thing I can see here is there's a source folder, so I want to dive into that because that's where the most of the code is going to be. I also see this Tanstack folder, which I'm a little bit curious about. If I open this up, it looks like it's related to route generation, so it probably generates some route related files. A little bit interesting. There's nothing in there that I really care about. I mostly am going to skip it, similar to how Next.js does something else in the .next folder. So inside the source here, I kind of want to look at routes first because that's what I care about the most. And immediately when I look at this, I noticed it's quite a bit different than what I get in Next.js, because this is very much not as folder based as I see. It's more file based, which is interesting. So it looks like they do file based routing instead of that folder based routing that the new app router Next.js works with. And it looks like there's some specific file naming characteristics that go on. I see things like $signs and .deep and so on. So that's definitely something that is interesting to look at. But index is probably the homepage. And as I can see, yes, this is the homepage and it matches the home route in my URL. So at least that is matching to my expectations of index is the homepage. Now, if I minimize this section down, I can look ahead at how they actually do their routing. And I noticed something interesting. They just have a basic function here, which is just like you would get inside of any React component, but they're not actually exporting this function like you would do inside of Next.js, and they have magic behind the scenes that hooks everything up. Instead, it looks like there's this create file route function, which you pass a path into, which I find interesting because when I was reading the documentation, I thought it said it was file-based routing, but it looks to be that you actually have to pass the path in. Now I'm going to change this to home and actually see what happens. And it looks like actually that causes an error. Argument of type home is not assignable to the parameter. Yeah, so it looks like it is file-based. I just need to make sure I pass in that file. And when I saved my page, it actually changed the path automatically back to what the path should be. So it looks like they have some type of stuff happening behind the scenes to force you into this particular pattern. And my guess is the whole reason they force you to write your code like this is to get type safety, because getting type safety based on file names is a lot harder than getting type safety based on code you wrote. So it is file based, but you have to write the path in here, and it's pretty much automatically going to be the correct path that you expect. I'm curious if I change this to like post, which is a route that I do have, if that'll actually work. And it looks like that does work, but when I save, again, it reverts me back. So no matter what I do, it looks like anytime I save this file, it forces me to have the correct path in here, which I find is a really interesting approach. Now, the next thing I want to look at, now that I kind of understand how this creating of a very basic route works, is I want to look at the route.tsx, or the root, I'm sorry, because this is most likely the root of my entire application. And if we take a look at this code, we can see I have a lot of head related stuff. So this is just head tags, super straightforward. These are meta tags. Okay, that's simple. Link tags, also pretty simple. Script tags, also pretty simple. I even have an error component, which I find is really interesting. This root component, I'm curious, that is something we create. Okay, that makes sense. Root component here. Yeah, and then we have a not found, and then we have the main component itself. Okay, that makes sense. So our root component just wraps all of our head related stuff. This is a special component that comes from Tanstack. That makes sense. And then inside the body, we just have a wrapper that contains our navigation. I'm guessing that's what it is. Yep. And then finally down here, oh, we have dev tools as well. Looks like that's down here under my camera. Let me move that out of the way. So yeah, we have a bunch of dev tool related stuff in here. I'm not going to really dive into that because that's way beyond the scope of learning what this tool does. And then the script section, it looks like that is also coming from Tanstack. I'm guessing that is to load any custom scripts that you get from here, but I'm not 100% sure because this is inside the head. So I would guess that would go in the head. I'm not really sure what this is for, but again, that's what the documentation is for. When you start diving into this and you want to understand what these particular things do, you go, oh, I wonder what this script does. I'll look at the documentation for that. For now, I'm still in the discovery stage, so I'm not too worried about figuring out what that particular thing does. Now here on the links, this is one thing I really like is these are type safe. That's what I read from the documentation. So you can see here I get type safety on all these different things. And that was something that when I was creating my own React router was actually probably the most challenging part of creating it, was getting all these type safety for everything across the entire application. Now I kind of want to look through and see if they have anything besides just the normal to field set here. We have active options. I'm curious what that is. Through option determine if the link should be considered active or not. Okay, yeah, that makes sense, because the active props is what you pass along, and this is just saying it must be an exact route instead of a partial, while these are all partial routes. That makes sense. So there's really nothing too complicated going on inside of this particular section of the route, so I'm okay with just closing out of that. Let's not save any changes I made. Now the next thing I want to look at while I'm in the routes section is I want to look at, okay, how do they handle routes that are actually page-based routes that have a parameter inside of them? And this post ID is kind of what I'm looking at here, and already this is significantly more complicated. I'm not going to be able to understand all of this. This is way beyond what I understand currently at the time, so I just want to look at an overall view of what this looks like. I have my file right up here, and I'm sure if I delete this and save, yeah, it automatically pre-populates. That's kind of cool. I actually quite like that because you don't need to worry about passing in the correct path here. As you can see, we have a loader here. This is for loading our data. It gets our params, and it looks like this is all type safe information, which is really nice. My guess is it's always going to come in as a string because it's part of the URL, and there's no way for you to type that otherwise. Like, it has to be a string, and they don't want to do any schema, doing stuff before that. That's just my guess. We have error component, which is kind of nice to see. That was the same thing we saw in the route. Same thing with component here. So it looks like they share a lot between creating a route and not. Same thing with not found. That's also in that section. So I like that they have all of this section right here just handled for you, the not found component. And I'm guessing this fetch post function, this probably renders not found. Yeah, throws not found as an error. So essentially that not found component will render anytime that this not found is thrown, which is kind of nice. So we can have custom not found components for that. Very similar to how Next.js would work. It's just slightly different. You're defining all of your stuff inside this function as opposed to defining it with different file names, which it's tough to say which way is better or worse. They both do the job quite well. Now here's where we kind of get a bunch of type safety stuff. You can see we get our post information from fetch post. This is something that I learned a little bit from reading the source code when I was writing my own router. So I at least have some familiarity with how this works because I use this exact same pattern in my router to give the type safety. Now if I scroll down a little further, this is actually what I was hoping to see inside the nav bar. You can see here I have params, and this is type safe, I believe. Like if I remove this, yeah, I do get an error, and this must be a string because it's inside params, which makes a lot of sense. Now I'm curious what this deep route is. So if I go to post, and I click on one of these routes, it looks like it's giving me a bunch of information over here, which is, oh, if I click deep view, then it gives me some more information. So interesting. So there must be some nested stuff going on here because when I click on a route, I get the route information on the right-hand side. And then if I click deep view, that gives me my own page that is not nested at all. So I want to look at specifically the post page because that's where my nesting most likely is happening. So we have our post, then we have our post index. Interesting. So post index just renders select a post, which is right here. Okay, interesting. And my post page itself is the one that renders the list on the left-hand side of my page. And yeah, they have an outlet for handling the nesting. That's the same as like React Router would work. So that's a little bit interesting. I'm not sure how the naming convention works yet, just from looking at this. But as you can see, this post index is something that renders out as a subchild of the post page itself. Index always appears to be like the first subchild, the main one. And then that's just saying select a post because we don't have a post ID yet. As soon as we have a post ID, it renders this particular page as the child. And then this underscore is, I'm guessing, what breaks you out of that child-parent relationship. Not 100% sure, just based on the naming, that's what it looks like. Now I could keep diving further into this particular section of routing, but I feel like I've understood quite well a lot of the stuff that is important to understand about the routing. I'd be curious to see if there's folder-based routing, because I do like having folders instead of just 100 files inside of here with different names, but we'll get to that eventually. Now I will want to go through styles, makes sense, utils, that, yeah, it's fine. This router is interesting. I wonder if part of this is automatically generated for you or if you have to put all of this in yourself, but it's kind of interesting. It has like score restoration and stuff inside of here. A lot of this looks like it's kind of redundant with the root section, so I'm curious to see how that goes about. And then this is all a generated file. Yeah, don't worry about this stuff. So overall, pretty much the entire project is in this roots folder. And if I close out of this, you can see we have Tailwind set up, which is nice. We have Vite set up. I really love Vite, so that's another bonus. Post CSS to go with Tailwind, which makes a lot of sense. And then this README probably explains some more information about this demo. Now, there were a lot of other demos inside of the documentation on the quick start section. If I scroll down, there's a bunch of these other demos that are right here, but I'm not really too worried about diving into these demos. I want to dive into the rest of the getting started documentation, because now that I have a general idea of how the code in this project works, I want to read through the getting started because that will give me a better explanation of what each part of the application is. So if I take a look at the documentation page, when I click on getting started, there's really nothing. There's just this build from scratch option, which is what I'm going to be reading through next. And then what I want to do is, you can see I have sections on learn the basics, and then a bunch of like more in-depth sections on everything you can do, followed by the examples and then a tutorial down here. And I like that it's in order. Learn the basics is obviously like the next step for me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read through this build a project from scratch to figure out how I can get started with my own project, and then maybe it will explain different things. I then want to learn the basics by reading through that. And then depending on where my knowledge is from there, I may decide to watch a YouTube video to try to get another explanation of this topic. Or if I feel pretty confident, I may start diving in and trying to write my very own basic project to get started with. As I was going through this, I actually ran into a little bit of a problem while going through this documentation. I didn't realize that this was actually 2 underscores before root. It's really hard to see with their documentation because there's no denotation between them. So to me, it looks like one single underscore when I was skimming this documentation. So I ended up calling this file underscore root.tsx, and I was getting some really weird, unhelpful errors, essentially saying certain files weren't generated properly. So a really important thing is, if you run into an error like that, I immediately was like, okay, well, I've copied code directly from the documentation. It must be somewhere in here I made a mistake. So I went through every single thing. I just started at the bottom where I was, and I went, okay, does this file look like it's in the correct location? I saw that it was. It looked like it was fine. Everything was good. I then went up here and I was like, okay, is this the right location? And I noticed when I looked at it, oh, this is 2 underscores, not 1 underscore. As soon as I fixed that, it fixed my problem. So if you do run into problem with these getting started documentation, which is honestly quite common, it's really important to make sure you've named all your files properly and copied over every single step by step, because it's really easy to miss something or misname something. Now, I went through all this documentation, got it all working, and I want to say one thing that I really like about this getting started version over the other one that I looked at is it has just a really simple route, which is great for just getting started. And also it has some update functions for server functions. I can't remember if the get function for getting a post was a server function or not, but here you can see we have server functions and how they actually work, which is really nice to see how server functions inside of this work, because obviously it's quite a bit different than how Next.js works. As you can see, we're calling these server functions down here, and it seems like everything is working fine. So I was able to get this working. One thing I noticed is there's no like quick start where I could just run like a npx command for like create Tanstack Start application. But one thing that I do know from my experience working with Vite is that Vite has an option for Tanstack Start in it. So I'm going to run that next to compare and contrast the differences. So turns out I was actually wrong. I went to go run this, and it turns out it's Tanstack Router, not Tanstack Start. So you do have to go through the manual step-by-step of Tanstack Start to get hooked up with an application. There is actually an option in the documentation. If I go to the quick start section, there was this counter right here, which is the exact same thing they have you create and build from scratch, at least from what I can tell. So my personal preference is when I go to start my own new project, if they don't have a simple command line tool, which I'm sure they probably will at some point, I'll probably just use the quick start for the counter as my starting code, because it's a very small and basic starting code where I can delete the stuff that I don't need and immediately get started with my project. So now that I've seen how easy it is to actually get started with this particular project, the next thing, and probably the most important step to making sure I can learn efficiently, is going to the learn the basics section. I don't like to jump straight into the code and just start trying to write code for something that I don't really have familiarity with. Instead, I like to learn the basics of how are things laid out, what are the different models and objects that I need to think of, how do the more high-level concepts interact with each other. I want to understand those things first before I start trying to write a bunch of code. So I like to read at the very least the basic documentation, and if I feel like it's sufficiently answer my questions, then I can start diving in and trying to create something with those tools. But I want to make sure I have a good overview of the different concepts inside this library before I start trying to write code with it. If I jump straight to the code right now, I'm not going to know enough to be able to efficiently write code. I'm going to get stuck and frustrated. So immediately as I'm reading through this, I'm already starting to get multiple questions answered. And one I'm noticing, it says, notice the scripts component. This is used to load all your client-side JavaScript for the application. So this just loads essentially all the code that is needed by Tanstack into the application. So I was curious what this was. Now by reading this documentation, I have a great idea of what this is and why it's used. Also, literally the very next section in the documentation is something important. You may be reading through documentation and you'll get to sections where it's like, hey, this is a really important feature. We have an in-depth guide right here that you should go check out. Usually what I like to do when I get to a section like this is I like to just open this in a new tab. I just control and then click on it. It'll open it up in a brand new tab for me. So now I have that open and I can check that out later if I want to, but I like to finish the documentation that I'm currently on unless I'm trying to deep dive into something. If I'm curious how routes work and that's all I care about, then I'll deep dive into this rabbit hole. But for me, I'm trying to get a high level overview. So I want to read the whole high level overview, and then routes, since it's probably the most important thing in the entire application, then I can dive further into this more in-depth guide into how routing works. Now, as you're reading through the documentation, you may run into things where you're not 100% sure what it means. For example, this section says every router hook that returns state is reactive, meaning it will automatically rerun the appropriate state changes. Now, I'm not 100% sure what they're trying to mean by that. Are they meaning that if a router hook has a loader inside of it and that loader changes, will it rerun? Does it mean it has to be like React state? I'm not 100% sure what that means, but it sounds like it's something important. If it's in the Getting Started beginner guide and it's marked as one of these bullet points here, I'm guessing this is important. So when I run into stuff like this, I like to either mentally take a note or write a note down next to me that says, hey, I don't really know what this means. I wonder if I can find out more about it. My guess is this navigation guide will tell me more, so I'm going to open that in another tab as well, and hopefully I can find out more about this after I finish reading the rest of this documentation. And maybe if I'm curious enough about this right now and I really want to know what this is, I can skim this navigation guide to see if they have a section specifically on that before I go further through this documentation. Now, sometimes when reading through the documentation, you may run into things that are not explicitly stated, but spark some curiosity or some knowledge on your part. When I was reading through this mutation section, I noticed it specifically talked about invalidating different caches, and all of these caches that it talks about are on the client. For example, my router cache and my query cache for Tanstack query. So I'm not sure if they have a server-side cache such as Next.js, which caches things very heavily on the server, or if they have just a router cache in this application. Haven't gotten far enough to figure that out, but this doesn't explicitly state that this uses only router caching and that there's no server-side cache, but it does kind of spark that question in my mind. And again, that's something that I'll write down to note later to look for in this application to say, hey, is there actually a server cache or is it just a router cache? Also, when you get to complicated code like this is a rather complicated file of code, make sure you really read through it carefully and understand what's going on. I probably had to read through this code 3 or 4 different times to really understand what each individual piece is doing. And I still don't understand everything perfectly because lots of these functions, I don't know exactly what they do. But based on the naming and the way that they're used, I have a general idea of how things are working, which reinforces that everything is done on the client side for caching, because if I look at this code, this is a custom React hook that is invalidating the caches on the client only. There's no server-side cache validation going on. And the only way I was able to figure that out was by reading the documentation here and by looking at the code. Like I said, I don't know if that's the case. There may be server-side caching as well in addition to this, but from what I can see here is that currently everything is being done directly on the client with the router or the query. So I just got done with the Learn the Basics section, and I'm going to be honest, it taught me a lot of the overall high-level pieces, but it didn't really give me very much in-depth knowledge into these different sections. But the nice thing is, as you can see, every single one of these sections has a guide that I can link out to and check out. So I think what I'm going to do next is still, instead of diving further into the code, I want to read through more of what the guide is doing, because there's certain things I've already learned that I think is really useful, such as data loaders are run both on the client and the server. And if you want something to be server only, you need to wrap it inside of that server function, whatever it's called, create server function, I'm not sure. But that is something that I didn't know before. I kind of saw it when I was looking through the code because I remember one section of code had it while the other section didn't. They were both using loaders, but with one with that function, one without. But now that I read the documentation, I understand why that is and that it wasn't just a fluke. So in order to determine what section I want to dive into next, I can kind of look through the sections over here or look through the different guide sections that they linked here. But for me, I think the most important things, the things that are much different than like Next.js or Astro, is going to be how server functions work, as well as how the routing system works, and probably even some server-side rendering, because I'm curious if they have caching. Also, if they have a section in here on caching, I would definitely read through that, but I don't really see anything on caching. I may read through the mutation guide right here because that might have some information about caching, but I think what I want to start with is the routing information, and then I want to dive into server functions and then possibly mutations if there's something with caching in there. So I clicked on the server routes to check that out, but this is actually something entirely different. This is like an API route if you're familiar with Next.js. It's like a route handler, not at all what I want. I did look over at my notes that I took though. I remember I had like file-based routing and navigation, and if I look at this, this actually references the Tanstack router documentation, which makes a lot of sense because this is built on top of Tanstack router, so I may read through this. But one thing that I noticed when I was scrolling through the site here is they have a section for migrating from Next.js. If you're familiar with one framework or library and there's a migration guide on how to go from one to the other, I actually highly recommend reading this, and I wish I read this earlier because this would give me a really good idea of how do the concepts from Next.js map to Tanstack Start. So I'm going to read through this guide now. So I read through this section on converting from Next.js to the Tanstack Start, and it did have some somewhat helpful things about how you actually do things. I mean, honestly, this table right here is probably the most useful, but a lot of this I've already seen through the rest of the documentation I read. I wish I kind of started here though, because this would give me a little bit better idea. Now, I've been reading through this documentation for about an hour now, and I'm getting a little bit bored of reading through documentation without actually doing anything important. So what I want to do, instead of jumping into the code, because I still have a lot of questions around like how do different caching things work, how do the pages connect, some more questions about routers, and I don't want to read the documentation for that. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to YouTube and try to find a beginner style tutorial on Tanstack Start and just watch through that. I may skip around, skim some parts, but I just kind of want to see overall how someone else explains its application like this, because usually when I watch a YouTube video, they're going to focus more on like the highlights and the important things, while the documentation has to explain everything. So this is a really great way for me to get more knowledge in a shorter amount of time, while also being able to see it a little bit more passively without having to read through stuff, which can get a little bit boring and a little bit tiring. Now, I just finished watching this video from Pedro Tech. It's Learn Tanstack Start in 7 minutes, and I wanted like a really quick refresher video to kind of remind me of the different things that I may have forgotten. When you're first learning something, I like to do a lot of kind of refreshers to really drill down on the important parts, and usually the most talked about things are the most important. So they talked about things like routing and so on. I learned a few new things, but it was mostly stuff I'd already seen before. And when I'm watching videos like this that are more refresher style content, I especially like to crank the speed on the video up really high, either like 2 to 3 times speed, just because I kind of want to like be able to get the knowledge as quickly as possible. Since especially I know a lot of the stuff in the video, it's okay to go at a faster speed, and then I can slow down if I need to when I get to specific spots that I really care about actually learning more about. Now, the next video I plan to watch is by WebDev Cody. It's a great channel, so if you haven't checked it out, I highly recommend you check it out. But this one's called The Important Parts of Tanstack Start. It's quite a bit longer at 27 minutes, so I'm still going to watch it at like 2 to 3 times speed and maybe even skip around to different sections. But the really nice thing is I think this will cover exactly what I want, because based on the title, it's the important parts of Tanstack Start, and based on the content WebDev Cody does, I know that this is probably going to fulfill the needs I want of explaining just the things that I care about and how they work in Tanstack Start. So I just finished watching through this video, and I have to say I actually really enjoyed this video. It's definitely not for someone that doesn't know anything about Tanstack Start, but if you have a little bit of familiarity with Tanstack Start, it really helps explain some of the different concepts, and it answered some of the questions I had, such as the fact that you can do folder-based routing or file-based routing or a combination of the two, as well as some other questions about how certain caching and related things worked. Now, I'm at the point where I want to start diving into the code and actually start building my project, because a lot of the questions I have are not so much how does Tanstack Start do X thing, and instead my questions are more along the lines of what happens if I do X, Y, and Z. And there's a small distinction between these two. The first question is more of a high-level question where I'm like, I don't even know how server functions work in Tanstack Start. And the second question is more, how does a server function work if I call it in this very specific way in an application? Those are the questions when you start to get to that point where you realize, okay, I need to start diving into the code and start testing those hypotheses. When you start to ask yourself those questions, that's a great sign that you're starting to understand how something works, and now you need to understand how all the nitty-gritty pieces of it work to get more of the edge cases figured out in your mind. Now, as you're diving into the code and starting to work on things, inevitably you'll run into different questions, which happened to me a lot as I've been diving into the code. And as soon as I run into any of those questions, I immediately try to solve it myself by saying, okay, what if I do this? What if I do this? But if it's more of a high-level question of how does Tanstack Start handle this particular thing, I dive into the documentation for that and search for the particular section I'm looking for. In this case, I'm looking through some data mutation related stuff, but it doesn't really matter. You just go to the section of the documentation that covers that, find the section you're looking for. You can control F to find it or do whatever you need. Find that particular section, read it, and now hopefully that explains what you're trying to get a hold of. Because the whole idea of moving into code and away from the documentation is so you can start playing around with it to see how it works in a real world environment. But obviously, I don't know everything there is to know about Tanstack Start. I'm going to run into problems, and when I run into those problems, I'm going to go to the documentation, figure out what those different things do, and then go back to the code so I can start playing until I get stuck again, bounce back to the documentation. I do that a bunch as I'm first learning something. I have a lot of experimentations in my code, and then I have a lot of time spent looking through tons of different documentation, figuring out why is it that this did what it did, because often when I'm experimenting, something may happen and I go, wait, that's not what I expected to happen. Let me look at the documentation to see why it didn't do what I expected. So it's been maybe 2 to 3 hours since I started this project of learning Tanstack Start, and I'm by no means an expert, but I've at least uncovered a lot of different stuff about how Tanstack Start works, and probably the biggest revelation that I made is that it's not some big brand new framework. Really, Tanstack Start is just a small little sprinkling of syntactical sugar on top of Tanstack Router. A lot of the features are built into Tanstack Router, and all they really did is add some of the more server actions, or as they call them, server functions on top of it, with some other nice to have things that just kind of glue together all the Tanstack Router related stuff. And instead of being really focused on the server side like Next.js is with all their really aggressive server side caching, instead Tanstack more focuses on like client side caching, where they're like, hey, we have Tanstack Query, which is absolutely amazing and probably the best client-side query library. It's got really great caching. We're just going to leverage that for the client-side cache. So if you need a complicated client-side cache, you just use the Tanstack Query library for that. So now that I have this relatively good familiarity with how Tanstack Start works, the next steps to be able to take your knowledge further are just to build out a larger scale project. Because up to this point, I haven't really built any projects that are large. I've really just been working with toy projects and playing around with various different things. But now the next step is to take a project, preferably one you've already built in the past, and build it out with this new library, framework, tool, whatever it is. So now I can take a project, I have tons of them on my YouTube channel that I've built, and just rebuild one of them using Tanstack Start. And that's a great way to see easily the comparisons between how one way works and how this new way works, which is a really great way to reframe your knowledge to be like, okay, now I see how the Tanstack Start does this, and I also can compare it to Next.js to make learning the new thing much easier. The reason I recommend creating a project you've already created before is because oftentimes some of the hardest parts about building a project are getting started with how do I do my styling, how is my database going to work, all these different things. But if you take a project you've already created and recreate it using a new framework, all of that stuff is already solved for you, and you only have to worry about how does Tanstack Start do these things. That's the only thing that you have to care about. So the project can be built relatively quickly while also giving you a huge amount of knowledge on the one thing that you care about. Because if I build a brand new project, I'm going to learn a lot of stuff, but only a small amount of that is going to be focused on Tanstack Start, and it's going to take me a very long time. And then once I've built out that clone project, essentially creating one project from another project I've already created, then the next step is to go ahead and build a completely from scratch project using Tanstack Start, because oftentimes when I build this first project where I'm doing a clone, I may realize, you know what, the way that Tanstack Start does something is quite a bit different than Next.js, and I kind of wish when I built this project with Tanstack Start, I actually did it in a different way, which would have been different than how I built the project originally with Next.js. So now when you build a project from scratch, you have that knowledge to know, okay, Tanstack Start expects me to be more client focused, so I'm really going to dive into the client side of things on this next project to really lean into the advantages of something like Tanstack Start. Now that's pretty much the full process. Now if you're thinking to yourself, you don't have any good projects to clone to create with these new frameworks or libraries, you're in luck because I have a huge repository of videos on YouTube that contain full massive projects. I'll link them right over here. You can use any of those projects that you want to be able to create and use with your own libraries and tools that you're trying to learn. Now with that said, thank you very much for watching and have a good day.